In this lecture, you are going to learn about Johnson's War on Poverty. The Johnson administration acted more in response to the Black freedom struggle than on its own initiatives. But Johnson, more than any other president, will make significant legislative changes to help end discrimination and poverty. Unfortunately, President Kennedy was assassinated just as he made good on his promise to seek strong anti-discrimination legislation. Nevertheless, once Johnson became president, he excelled behind the scenes, where he could entice or threaten legislators into support of his objectives. Once Johnson becomes president, he will sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which guaranteed access for all Americans to public accommodations. Public education, employment, and voting thus sounded the death bell of the South's system of segregation and discrimination. Then in August 1965, following the Selma marches, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which empowered the federal government to intervene directly to enable African Americans to register and vote, transforming Southern politics. Moreover, Johnson also issued an executive order in 1965 that required employers with government contracts to take affirmative action to ensure equal opportunity. Then in 1968, Johnson will pass the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, upon the assassination of Martin Luther King, which banned racial discrimination in housing and jury selection. In an authorized federal intervention when states failed to protect civil rights workers from violence. Johnson will also fulfill the Kennedy promise to end poverty and make it his own. Fast on the heels of the Civil Rights Act came a response to Johnson's call for an unconditional war on poverty. On a May morning in 1964, President Johnson laid out a sweeping vision for a package of domestic reforms known as the Great Society, speaking before that year's graduates of the University of Michigan. Johnson called for an end to poverty and racial injustice and challenged both the graduates and American people to enrich and elevate our national life and to advance the quality of our American civilization. At its heart, he promised the Great Society would uplift racial and economically disfranchised Americans to long denied access to federal guarantees of equal democratic and economic opportunity while simultaneously raising all American standards and quality of life. Johnson wanted to usher what came to be known as the Great Society and succeeded in doing so, given the sheer amount and breadth of the new laws passed during his administration. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 authorized 10 programs under newly created Office of Economic Opportunity, allocating $800 million for the first year. The Act Direct Aid included a new food stamp program, giving poor people greater choice in obtaining food, and rent supplements that provided alternatives to public housing projects for some poor families. We will also see the Head Start program started as an 8-week summer camp run by the Office of Economic Opportunity for 500,000 children ages 3 to 5. Since the program's inception, it has served over 32 million vulnerable children in America. Johnson's Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 marked a turning point by involving the federal government in K-12 education. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act was the first sustained and significant federal investment in public education, totaling more than $1 billion. Congress also passed the Higher Education Act, which vastly expanded federal assistance to colleges and universities for buildings, programs, scholarships, and loans. Federal student loans and work-study programs were also established to offer 140,000 Americans the chance to go to college who could otherwise not afford it. The Great Society also established the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, federal investments in the arts and letters that fund American cultural expression to this day. Johnson also established an urban renewal program. The mass exodus to suburbia after World War II left many major cities in poor condition. Affordable, dependable housing was hard to find, especially for the poor. The Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965 provided federal funds to cities for urban renewal and development. For cities to receive the funds, they had to establish minimum housing standards. The law also provided easier access to home mortgages and a controversial rent subsidy program for vulnerable Americans who qualify for public housing. We will also see the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, which provided the elderly and the poor with medical care. In 1945, Harry Truman had advocated a national health care insurance. And as part of the Great Society, Congress passed an expansion to these programs in 1965. Medicare, which insures people over 65, and Medicaid for the impoverished, will allow the most in need access to health care. President Richard Nixon and Congress expanded the program in 1972 to cover disabled persons under age 65 and to expand services in speech therapy and physical therapy. Supplemental Security Income SSI for the elderly and disabled poor, as in addition to the Medicaid, was also added during the Nixon years. Moreover, as part of Johnson's plan, he felt that the key to uplifting disfranchised and impoverished Americans was involving poor and marginalized citizens in the actual administration of poverty programs, what they called maximum feasible participation. Community action programs will give disfranchised Americans a seat at the table in planning and executing federally funded programs that were meant to benefit them. A significant sea change in the nation's efforts to control poverty, which had historically relied on local political and business elites or charitable organizations for administration. For all its success, the flood of reform legislation dwindled after 1966, when midterm elections primed the Democrats' majorities in Congress and backlash against government programs arose. Critics argue that the Great Society program discouraged initiative by giving the poor handouts. Some critics argue that ending poverty will require a redistribution of income, raising taxes and using those funds to create jobs, overhaul social welfare systems, and rebuild slums. The backlash against some of Johnson's policies and an anti-war movement crippled his leadership, and coupled with the Vietnam War, it became more and more difficult to fund the war on poverty. Measured by statistics, the reduction in poverty in the 1960s was considerable, but certain groups benefited more than others. Large numbers of the aged and members of male-headed families rose out of poverty, but African Americans escaped poverty at a slower rate than whites, and the plight of female-headed families actually worsened. However, later presidents and Congresses had left intact the bulk of the Great Society, including Medicare and Medicaid, food stamps, federal spending for arts and literature, and Head Start. Moreover, the war on poverty inspired and empowered a new generation of minority and poverty community activists who had never before felt, as one put it, that this government is with us. That is all for now. Please watch the next video lecture to learn more.